Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
It began in 2020, an emergency response to the pandemic. The government of British Columbia started giving out prescription opioid pills to people addicted to street fentanyl. The program is called Safer Supply. The idea is simple. If you give someone who is using fentanyl access to a clean, pharmaceutical-grade opioid, they will be less likely to overdose from the highly toxic street drug. The BC government expanded the program in 2021, earmarking $22 million over 3 years for this first-in-Canada experimental drug policy, with a promise to monitor and evaluate the program and change it if needed. Last week, the government did just that. It announced a severe tightening of control over prescribed safer supply drugs. After 3 years, the program is getting an overhaul. This comes in the wake of mounting evidence that these government-supplied pills are not being taken by drug users at risk of overdose, but instead being diverted, sold on the black market for cash, or traded for more potent street drugs. Now provincial health officials scramble to correct course. How did they get it wrong? Is safer supply a good idea? I'm David Smith. Today on The Big Story, I'm speaking with Dr. Julian Somers. Dr. Somers is a clinical psychologist and distinguished full professor at Simon Fraser University. He has spent a career studying drug addiction and advising governments on drug policy. And he has been one of the fiercest critics of the BC government's Safer Supply program. Hi, Dr. Somers. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, David. It's great to be with you.
So last week, the David Eby government in British Columbia made a huge change to its Safer Supply program. Since the program was first expanded in 2021, drug users accessing Safer Supply were able to take their pills home from the pharmacy like anyone else and self-administer their doses as they liked. But moving forward now, each dose will have to be taken individually and supervised by a pharmacist or another health provider. That change came in response to public outcry about the program after news reports surfaced about a leaked internal memo from the BC government that said they had found, quote, a significant amount of the opioids prescribed to drug users were being sold on the black market. So given that evidence, Dr. Somers, do you think this is a good change?
I think it's an important symbolic change. It on its own, it isn't much cause for celebration beyond that. We need to consider that in the years that this program has been implemented and championed by the province, we've been continuing to lose between 6 and 7 people per day to drugs in BC. Those individuals we now know are the majority of them unemployed. We've seen drug poisoning become the leading cause of death among children and youth in BC, and the majority of those kids were clients of our Ministry for Children and Family Development, which administers foster care. These are simply glaring points of evidence illustrating needs among the population that is struggling with addictions, as well as unemployment, as well as poor and usually inadequate housing, and untreated mental illnesses and other challenges. So for the government under duress, not their choice, due to this really dramatic leaked report, they're making this fairly modest change from allowing people to carry drugs to essentially compelling them to stay in the pharmacy while they're ingesting them. That's leaving everything else that I referred to as unaddressed today as it has been for the last 8 years.
There seems to be A couple of different debates going on now in light of this new evidence. Hardcore advocates for safer supply say this change to a supervised model more or less kills the functionality of the program. There's no point in doing this way. People have said this. People who are severely addicted and need 5, 6, 7 doses a day won't spend their whole day going back and forth to the pharmacy. They'll keep using street drugs. On the other side of things, we have anecdotal evidence of diverted, safer supply drugs ending up in the hands of teenagers and people who use drugs but may not be severely addicted. The Ministry of Health itself says it has given out about 22.5 million doses of opioids through this program since 2021, and it admits a large portion of those doses were diverted, resold, traded, what have you. So it would seem that the academic idea of safer supply as a response to the drug crisis is maybe clashing with the harsher realities of drug addiction, criminal enterprise, and human nature. Do you think the concept of a prescribed safer supply program has merit if it's designed properly, or should we be moving away from this idea?
I think we should be moving away from an emphasis on trying to tweak the drug supply when there is such compelling evidence of unmet needs in the population that we should be concerned about, and needs that have for decades been well-established links to the risk for addiction. So I already mentioned social isolation, unemployment, and other hardships that people are suffering. Keep in mind, David, that this whole project to prescribe our way out of a crisis never had any kind of an exit strategy. So we heard initially, of course, we've had methadone and other forms of opiate agonist therapies for many years in Canada. This new way of prescribing or dispensing drugs was introduced with the claim that it's supposed to reach people who are not engaged in care. And okay, that's fine. There are people who are alienated from care. I've worked with many over the years. But what's the plan to then engage them in care? What's the plan to engage them in a process of support and rehabilitation that is not only addressing their glaring unmet health needs, but that is specifically tailored to help them have a greater chance of reducing their drug use, possibly even eliminating their drug use? And that's desirable because the drugs that we're talking about are objectively harmful. There's no comparison between the drugs that we're describing and drugs that are currently commonly consumed, alcohol and others. Even though harms associated with alcohol are considerable, when the Compassion Club model was introduced here in Vancouver, dispensing drugs, this kind of a showcase of, air quotes, safe supply. If you have a look at the first of the two papers, about half, 47% of the people who received those drugs had a poisoning episode, at least one poisoning episode in the few months of follow-up period. Now, if we were still living in prohibition, and we decided, okay, we're going to repeal prohibition, we're going to make alcohol available, and we discovered that within the first few months of repeal, half of the people who bought alcohol almost died, I think we would change course immediately. And that's what we should be doing here. These are objectively dangerous drugs in the short term, and evidence shows that they are also objectively bad for our health when consumed for a prolonged period of time. So our focus, if our focus is going to be the health and functioning and even simply listening to what people want long term, we need to get our heads around the idea of providing people with a pathway off of drug dependency.
I'd like to ask you about the drugs themselves that are given out through this program. Predominantly, it's something called hydromorphine. It's an opioid. It's usually given out in 8 milligram tablets, based on my understanding. Can you give our listeners some perspective on how powerful that drug is in an 8 milligram dosage? If a handful of these safer supply pills were diverted and ended up at a college party, and someone who doesn't use or is not dependent on opioids were to take one, how strong a dose of hydromorphine is 8 milligrams in one pill?
So for somebody who has no tolerance to opioids at all, 1 or 2 pills might be enough to cause respiratory arrest. So they would suddenly be, it would be a medical emergency. On the other hand, our bodies, the human body in general, adapts quite readily to opioids, meaning that if we were to begin with a fraction of hydromorphone, move up to more potent drugs, we could eventually, or we would actually expect to eventually need to administer powerful opioids like fentanyl in order to achieve the same experience, the same subjective reaction that we first got when we began with hydromorphone or heroin, for instance. And this is partly because we produce very, very closely similar chemicals inside our own bodies. We're well prepared to not only receive these types of drugs, but to then adapt to them. And then the problem is that this tolerance, once it develops to a certain point, there's very little difference in terms of the doses that people are taking between the amount that you need to get a subjective effect and the amount that puts you essentially into the zone of a lethal dose. Those become there's no difference between them. This is partly what makes it such a dangerous lifestyle for people to be engaged in. And as a result of that, when people are offered relatively mild or low potency forms of opioids, depending upon their tolerance, and if they're tolerant to fentanyl, hydromorphone is essentially going to be of little interest to them. And we knew this when the program got started. There was never any doubt about the mismatch between what we were providing and what people were going to need if they were going to continue using drugs. So right from the get-go, what we were really doing was introducing a fungible asset into the communities of drug users that they would then sell or barter for the drug that they prefer, all of which at the end of the day means that we have net increased the volume of drugs in that community. Hence, we are now reading regular news stories of trafficking busts in which police are identifying thousands and even tens of thousands of hydromorphone pills that have been diverted in exactly the manner that I'm describing.
It seems like perhaps a policy that maybe has gotten away from the government, where they implemented this with a promise to continually evaluate and reevaluate it and make changes if needed. And it's quite a remarkable about-face that the British Columbia government has done here. It wasn't very long ago where they were denying news reports of diversion, saying it's not a serious problem, it's a very low percentage of the doses, it's not a big enough issue that it should impact how we're administering this program. Now they've completely flipped their position. We know that they have evidence internally, which has been leaked, to show that, quote, a significant number of these prescriptions are being diverted. So why do you think the government's doing this now? And are you satisfied with the accountability and the transparency of the EB government here? I noticed that there have been calls now from the political opposition, the Conservative Party in British Columbia, for a public inquiry into this program so that all of this information can be made public. Do you think that's necessary?
It is necessary. It absolutely is necessary. Let me loop back to the part of your question that touched on their commitment to transparency and accountability. So this is a government, through various representatives of the government, including the premier, health ministers now, we've had a couple, ministers for mental health, the provincial health officer, and others who were aware of parents grieving the loss of their children. I'm talking about teenagers and young adults, and who said that's a tragic outcome. It's a very rare event. We have no evidence of widespread diversion or harms related to that. That has been their refrain throughout this entire episode. And people like me know they're lying. Now everyone knows they were lying because this leaked report confirms that people inside the health ministry knew of large-scale diversion and a pyramid of fraud involving pharmacies and kickbacks and other things like that. This means, David, that those government representatives who looked grieving parents in the eye and told them what they claimed to know were lying. So look, they should have, they were urged to, I and many others urged them, ensure that there is a traceable ingredient inside your so-called safe supply so that we'll know when there is evidence of diversion or if there's evidence of diversion. They refused. So there's a huge problem of credibility and transparency, and there's also a huge problem of collaboration between the provincial health officer, between researchers, between various investors in pharmaceutical companies, all of whom either are in or once held positions of importance in the public health administration of the province. So this really needs to be unpacked quite seriously. We need to look at how we got into this mess. We need to look at what safeguards need to be in place or shored up so that we don't experience this type of thing again. And a third one is, what are some better options available to us if we're going to invest so much time and money in order to do a better job in this crisis? There absolutely are better options, and the province has actually turned a deaf ear to them.
Okay, let's talk about some of the alternative approaches that can be taken that are different from the approach of the British Columbia government. Dr. Somers, you are a proponent of what's called recovery-oriented system of care. I understand you've been advising the Alberta government on its drug policy. Can you explain for our listeners, please, what is recovery-oriented care? And how does the Alberta model work differently than the BC model?
This alternative approach, recovery-oriented system of care, is a way of underscoring at the planning level that there are a wide array of government activities that have a direct impact on rates of addiction and drug-related problems. It includes a range of things that aren't usually thought of together in an integrated way when planning. I'm talking about things like policing, surveillance, our laws, our approaches to housing, our opportunities for employment or re-engaging people in employment, mental health related services, and those that are specific to addiction and to drugs. All of them play a kind of a role as members of an orchestra, and they need to be in balance in order to get the best results from our public investments. So that's really the kind of the lens that this recovery-oriented system of care approach provides. It eliminates the idea that you're going to solve a drug-related crisis simply by creating a minister for mental health and addictions or something of that nature. We need to be looking at it in a much broader way. So in the Alberta case, they have, as we do and many provinces and territories do, a visible street addiction problem. That means that addressing that needs to have components that include ways of getting people off of the street right away. So they've developed a large number of recovery communities that people can choose to go to. They've created navigation centers where people can go. And in these navigation centers, you essentially have access in almost like a trade fair. Representatives of multiple different ministries and services are there, and you go around and you can get help from as many as you need, and they can work because they're all in the same room. They can work in a coordinated way. So that's kind of in a thumbnail sketch how this approach touches down and can be made concrete. The ways the different jurisdictions would proceed with implementing a recovery-oriented system of care is likely going to be different from place to place. But like, for example, here in BC, I think we'd be crazy if we don't cast a serious eye on how we're addressing foster care. Um, it's some fraction of 1% of kids in BC are in foster care, and yet they are the clear majority of the kids who we're losing to poisoning. So let's not waste our time imagining a broad brush approach that is meant to touch the lives of every single British Columbia youth when we have such compelling evidence that the problem is quite localized to kids who are in a particular form of risk. And so these are just further illustrations of taking this all of government approach and taking a clear-eyed way of implementing that to meet the needs that appear to be evident in a particular jurisdiction.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you for that. And in closing today, a more general question. Very curious to hear your thoughts on this. What would you say is the biggest misconception about drug addiction in our society today?
Cool question. So one thing I'd emphasize at the beginning, I love talking about this subject, and the term addiction is often leads into some confusing dialogues, and in part, I believe it's because the term itself, addiction, is what we call a Janus term or a auto-antonym. It basically has its opposite built into it. So we use the term addiction both to refer to things that are like being enslaved. We also use the term to refer to things that are like liberation. And when people go from experiencing negative or harmful addictions to a state that they refer to as recovery, one of the main components that they describe is going from a situation of feeling out of control, a loss of personal agency, into a feeling of freedom and renewed ability to direct their own lives. So that's just as background. But to your specific question, I think one of the things that we need to consider more today is that the war on drugs, if it taught us anything, it's that we are likely capable of achieving relatively modest gains in the health of people in our communities if all we focus on is trying to interrupt or change the supply of drugs. We can do that ad nauseum, and we're not going to make big differences. And by the way, I think that is also the Achilles heel of the so-called safe supply program. It focuses on trying to make a difference by changing the supply. Instead, almost all of the evidence of what's modifiable from the field of addiction is on the demand side of the equation. If we focus our attention on prioritizing, cultivating opportunities for our youth to be engaged and forward-looking in their lives, opportunities for education, opportunities for a future, opportunities for lives worth living, then that's really where we have the greatest evidence of how we can actually reduce problems related to addiction. And ultimately, these two areas of focus, reducing supply, reducing demand, should be brought together in an ensemble, and maybe a recovery-oriented system of care is an approach that would lead us to that. But I think our overlooking of the importance of demand is one of the key oversights in many of our current drug policy discussions.
Overlooking the importance of demand. Can you expand on that a little bit? What does that mean?
Well, if we look at the people who are most at risk, they're glaringly socially isolated, and they are glaringly without opportunities to cultivate lives that to themselves are worth living. One of my first mentors in this field is a psychologist named Bruce Alexander, and he had a big impact on me. His experimental work illustrates this, I think. He conducted experiments known as the rat park studies, and what he showed is that rats, when placed in isolation, in cages, will have a marked preference for a morphine solution over a calorie solutions, a liquid chow. And they'll continue consuming more and more of the opioid as they become tolerant to it, higher doses. If you take those same rats even after they've become tolerant, and move them into a park-like setting with other rats and have the same choices between morphine solution and chow, they'll switch. Their preferences will switch, and they will instead begin orienting to chow. And the way we interpret that is that we've literally given the rats more interesting things to do. And so this is what I mean by demand. In this experimental setting, what Bruce and his colleagues are showing is that it's possible to abruptly shift things that influence demand for drugs or demands that lead to addiction by providing opportunities for social integration and literally better things to do. That's clearly evidence that's applicable to humans. And in my career, I've had the opportunity to conduct randomized trials with human beings showing much the same thing. So that's really, think more about demand and think less about try to achieve big wins solely by focusing on supply.
Okay, fascinating. That's our time for today, Dr. Somers. Thank you so much again for joining me here on the show. It's been a fascinating conversation. I hope the listeners have enjoyed it as much as I have.
Well, thank you, David. I've enjoyed it too.
And again, that is Dr. Julian Somers, clinical psychologist, expert in drug policy and addiction research with Simon Fraser University. And that is the big story for today. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. We'd love to hear from you. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all of your other favorite podcast players. Please remember to rate, review, follow, and share. I'm David Smith. Thank you for listening.